Hello, my friends. Today is the 1st of August, 2024. I thought that after my little rant about the French Olympics, I should move on to other things. And I was thinking about what I could talk to you about today. For a few minutes, I thought about the possibility of what is happening in Venezuela, but then I dismissed the thought. I didn't think it was basically because I actually was expecting it to a large degree, and also in the manifestation that happened, what happened in Venezuela in the elections. I say this because I am not from Venezuela, and I don't know any Venezuelan people, and I don't know what the domestic situation is there, what it's like. But I tend to look at politics from the geopolitical context. And so it could be quite possible, and indeed some of you may think it is, that Maduro is a terrible person, a dictator, and so on and so forth. Okay, but I look at it from the geopolitical aspect of things. And so I know that this particular person, Maduro, is not willing to surrender Venezuelan oil to its, not easily anyway, to its neighbor to the north. And so there have been quite a few attempts to, as they say euphemistically, regime change, which is really coups, you know. So I expected this, that if he won, there would be demonstrations and so on saying that he didn't, and I truly expected the leader of the opposition, friendly to the north, who would be a woman. I you know my beef about women leaders nowadays, who have renounced femininity and are not feminine but feminist, that line of thought. So I don't think I want to do that, talk about that to you. Another thing that I've been thinking about is the figure of Macron, his personality, and what is happening there with himself as a person. Because while all that was happening, he actually at that moment tweeted, you know, this is France. And there is a peculiar, I want to study him psychologically a little bit, the kind of person that he is. But because I have been talking about the Olympics, I didn't want to talk about that again, go back to France. So I decided to do something completely different today. Basically because I am reading a very interesting book. The book is, the book's in Spanish. I don't know whether it has been translated into English. It's The Secret History of Protestantism by a historian, Javier Barraycoa. And I was very pleased to see some interviews with him. And so I'm going to share with you his thought, because he's also thinking about what is happening today and the geopolitics of today. And he's beginning to see a line of what happened before, which is happening now. You know that I have told you many times, everything has happened before. So I'm going to talk about Protestantism and how it affected the world, what used to be called Christendom, and where we are today because of it. And today I'm going to share with you some thoughts about Luther, the reformer, and then we'll move on tomorrow to other aspects of Protestantism. Calvin, who was so very, very important, perhaps with the passing of time, actually much more important, his influence, than Luther's was. But Luther was the first, and so on, and also all the other manifestations, for example, the Anabaptists, which were at the beginning a revolutionary movement, actually, and you're going to see how it all, how it all began to how it all started and how it went on, and one thing leading to another. The Anabaptists was a very, very powerful movement. At that time, actually, about 300,000 people following it. You will see that they are rebelling against the princes and the temporal powers, but I'll come to that. But of the many Anabaptist sectors, there was, for example, one, although they were revolutionary, then some of them became pacifists. One of them, the Amish, who then went to Russia and then ended up now in the United States, as we know. So it's fascinating, the history. So it's so complex, and there are so many variants that I'm just going to deal with Luther, how it all started, as it were, and get to just before Calvin, okay? Now, with Luther, the first thing to deal with is something that is actually false, but it has been accepted as true, and it has become a sort of a myth already, something that you cannot change. And that was that he rebelled against the Pope because one of the things was the indulgences, yes, something that everyone has accepted because of the corruption in morals of the Catholic Church and so on. Okay, this is false. He was, and I will read you quotes from Luther himself in letters to the German princes, where he says, it's not that he didn't accept that was going on, but he says that was the least of it, that was not my thing, that was the least of it all. The main thing for him was certain doctrines. That is what he was concerned about. The issue of the indulgences, nevertheless, is something that had been an issue for reform for a long, long time. Reform within the church up to that time had been consistent throughout the ages. So we see so many religious orders, St. Francis with the Franciscans, St. Dominic with the Dominicans, the Augustinians. Luther was a monk, a Catholic Augustinian monk, that they had their reform, the Carmelites with Saint Teresa of Avila. The reform was something that was always being done within the church. It was, I'm not trying to suggest that wasn't happening, but it has to a certain extent also been misunderstood. I'll give you an example, and I gave you this example in some video about a year ago. I remember talking about it, but there is no way that you can remember it. But just as an example how it can easily be misunderstood. When I was visiting one time about, 20 years ago, I was visiting in my hometown the local convent there of nuns, the Poor Clares, and I was going to give them a talk about whatever, some mystical writings and so on. Okay, so while I was waiting there to be received, there was a young lady who came in and knocked, and a lovely lady, she just said, when the nun came forward, she said, Mother, I just want to ask you if you could all say a prayer for me, because I'm getting married next weekend. And I would appreciate that very much. And something like that. And the nun said, well, of course. And what is your name? And when is it happening? And so on. And they talked for a little while. And then this lady was carrying a little basket with fruit and eggs, something like that. And she said, oh, by the way, I brought this for you. Thank you, the nun said, because they live on donations from people from outside. They do sell embroidery. They do fantastic embroidery works. They do cakes and cookies, and they sell things, and that is how they make their living. But from time to time, people come in and give them a dozen eggs, whatever it is. Okay, so do you see, in that particular circumstance, this young lady was not buying the prayer of the nuns. Okay, the nuns had accepted, yes, of course we'll pray for you. But she said, oh, here you are, something that I brought for you. So it wasn't as crude as, going to a priest and saying, say a mass for me. Let me buy a mass. Here are 20 euros. It was never as crude as that. So there is a way here for some misunderstanding. Okay, but worse than indulges, which I'm not saying that there might have been many abuses, but at the time of Luther, it was particularly, people are talking about it because of the Basilica of St. Peter being built at the time, the Pope Julius II, I believe it was. And so he was asking for donations from the rich. And so, yeah, there could be their monies, even if they didn't use brown envelopes. That there was an issue. Worse than indulgences actually was what was happening, especially in the 9th and 10th centuries. The issue of simony. Simony is, and this was worse, and this was real corruption, when, for example, if you were a priest, you would, you have to say bribe. You would bribe your bishop to promote you to bishop or whatever it was. In other words, you were actually buying the promotion. That was real corruption. Much, much worse than, someone bringing a dozen eggs to the local priest kind of thing. But that was not Luther's concern, although he did mention it once to his friends. So I'm going to start this talk by emphasizing that his reform, and they themselves, and he himself and his followers actually admitted to this, was not actually a reform. It was a rupture, it was a breaking away from, it was a revolution, because his main thing was about doctrine. Okay, it wasn't a reform that is done within the church. So the moral decadence and the moral degeneracy that might have been there was not his main reason. So there is this myth that I think we have to unveil a little bit. Also, the myth that he nailed his 95 theses at the door of the, it was supposed to be the door of the Church of All Saints, some say at the University of Wittenberg. That is not true. Okay, first of all, it was not at the university, which was a normal thing for professors to hang what they were going to talk about, what the lectures were going to be about. You put it at the front of the door. Pretty much now they would put it online, what they were going to talk about. This actually is supposed to have happened in a church, but the 95 Theses Against Indulgences and so on, that is false. That has never occurred. It was something that was introduced in his complete works after he was dead. Melanchthon, the other theologian, and many of his close friends, to exalt the figure of Luther, and you're going to understand why. The only reference about indulgences that Luther himself made was actually in a letter humbly written to his bishop. Actually, Luther, you remember, was a monk, where he writes a letter to his bishop and asks humbly to be allowed to discuss these 95 theological theses. This was normal. If you wanted to discuss something, you would have to go through the bishop, ask for his authorization before the debate could take place. Okay, if you wanted to organize a debate about something, okay. Luther had already written to Erasmus, telling him that, very specifically, that the indulgences was the least of it. His main point, the main point that he wanted to make, is his great spiritual revolution, is to, in this revolution of his, is to affirm especially the concept of servo arbitrio. We understand it as free will. He calls it servo, servant, slave, arbitrio, which is therefore a new theology, a new anthropology derived now from this theology, which consists in the fact that what he held was that man had been left destroyed by original sin. Man is therefore not free, and therefore the only way to be justified, in other words, that is how he put it, the only way to obtain salvation is by means of an act of faith. Careful here, because he uses the word faith already here in a sense which is different from what Catholics understand by faith. In his case, it would be, okay, faith for a Catholic is you believe without necessarily having had a proof. In other words, it's a question of trust, it's a question of abandonment, it's a question of acceptance. That's your faith, you believe. Yeah, in his case, he understands it, I would say, a little bit more intellectually, more to do with the intellect. I'm trying to understand it more from the intellect than the heart, as it were, because he says that there has to be a voluntary act of saying, I believe. Yes, it's almost a subjective voluntarism, voluntarism, as it were, of saying, I believe, I want to believe. Yeah. I wish to believe, and in doing so, by this assertion, I am saved. Therefore, because of this, faith, works, or conduct, is normally translated as works, is not necessary for one to be saved. I find this rather strange. I think that I have considered this point already. If what you believe does not affect who you are and how you behave yourself and the things that you do, your conduct, I don't understand it, because then that faith is barren. I cannot just say that faith only, to me, to my understanding, and then go and live in whichever way I want. It doesn't make sense to me. So he was a very intelligent man, so I'm trying to understand how he got to this idea. Luther was, I think he confesses himself to be a man of extremes. He was not an ordered man. He was a disordered man. He felt strongly and went very quickly to extremes. And so for a time, for example, he would go to, before all this, he would go to confession, they say, practically every half hour, believing that he would be condemned, that, if he died at that moment, he would go to hell. Not quite understanding love or forgiveness of God. I mean, it's like he was a little bit obsessed with his sins. Couldn't abandon himself in, yes, you are a sinner, but this obsession that he was going to go to hell because of his sins, I think is something that plays up with him a little bit. I'm going to end up saying that I don't think he was a bad man at all. I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to understand his personality a little bit. Okay, so it was to be your act of faith alone. I believe, I want to believe, I wish to believe. Yeah. He actually goes as far as saying that even the commandments, or following the commandments, would not be necessary. And from there it evolves a sort of a very strange theology. Strange because it can be summarized, or he, to a certain extent, summarized it with the phrase in Latin, pecca fortior. Sin as much as you want. Sin strongly. If you don't doubt that pure faith in this subjective way that he understood it, by that alone you can be among the saved. Sin strongly, pecca fortior. He writes that, it's written to a friend. And then you will be able to dispel all your doubts about salvation and everything. So you can actually fornicate or get drunk, as he would do later on, every day if you want to. But you profess this faith and you cannot be condemned. Hence his sentence, be strong, have faith, sin strongly. This is difficult to understand nowadays, and this has been somewhat softened during the centuries. Okay. I have some notes here about the indulgences having been dealt with many councils and so on. Okay. So something that you may not know out of this chaos of a man was that although the official narrative is that he died peacefully, beatifically, they say, he did not. He committed suicide. It is registered by his servant that after a night of drunkenness he went there the next morning and he found him hanged. It is something that he would do very often, get drunk. Why? By the way, if you don't believe this about his drunkenness, he wrote letters to his friends, and those letters are available. He says that he would get drunk. Let me see if I find that. Every night he would, in his words, I would get hammered, wasted. But he says he doesn't regret it, and I think he did. He didn't regret it, he says, because obviously once you follow your own doctrine of faith alone saves, well, you can do practically everything you want and nothing happens. You're saved anyway. But this was his servant's testimony. So there is a little bit of the tragic character here. This is what I want to say. The harshest attacks against the Catholic faith or Catholic doctrine is, or against the church, the worst of all, the most hateful of all, have always come from priests and nuns, and it's a matter of psychological study, and since I'm not a psychologist, I'm going to embark on pontificating about psychology here. And what I see is that if you truly you no longer believe, let's say you're a priest, okay, and you lost your faith, that's fine. It happens, and it's a natural thing, actually. Okay, so then what you do is to say, I no longer believe, I can't do this. So you tell your bishop, you go there and you leave, and then you go and live your life, and you get married and have children and live happily ever after. Famous philosopher here in Oxford, Dr. Anthony Kenny, who was the what do they call in Balliol College, provost, principal. Anyway, he was a philosopher. He had been a Jesuit priest, and he lost his faith, and he's a great philosopher. I believe he's still alive. If he is, I think he is in his 90s probably. And he became a great philosopher. He admits that in his seminary days, he became a Jesuit. In his seminary days, he learned what was going to be extremely important in his life later as a philosopher, Greek and Latin and the classics and so on. Anyway, he lost his faith, he left. Okay, so there is no remorse here, because you know in your hearts that you no longer believe. I'm sorry, as much as I want to, I can't. I find that all this is nonsense. Sorry. And you leave. Okay? But you leave kind of at peace with yourself. What happens when you know in your heart of hearts that you're not doing the right thing, or you have that remorse that is an excuse for something else, for a simpler life, for example, or for something different, or for name recognition if you are a philosopher, or for something else. There is a certain amount of guilt and remorse there as a sediment in your heart, that the only way you can deal with it is to project it. Okay, so you lost your faith, fine, but the actual hatred afterwards, you see it in nuns too when they leave, that comes from a different point. I remember I told you about someone who was very popular in the 60s, had gained a lot of fame, a nun, and because he sang so beautifully, and I don't know how, she made a record. She and the whole community made a record. Dominique, Nick, you remember that one from the 60s? You old-timers. Anyway, he was a nun, and then he became so famous. And, you know, her song got to what we used to call the hit parade, the charts, right at the very top. Oh, my goodness, the television came to the convent, this and that. And anyway, she left. And then she continued to make records, but they were not as successful. The whole thing was this nun singing, and they used to call her the singing nun. But after that, after she left and embraced the world, she was just one of many, and nothing happened with her career. And so then she became very active with feminist issues and pro-abortion and anything that would go against the church. That was her thing. I think there was a kind of that little worm inside, that little remorse that perhaps you shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. Anyway, she committed suicide too in 1985. It was all very sad. So I think that Luther started by having genuine doubts. He was a theologian, and things did not connect to his way of thinking, and perhaps to his personality too. And so, but then what happens is that he laicizes himself. He leaves the priesthood and the monastery himself without going through the usual things of informing your bishop. He just said no and left, and got married to a former nun, Catarina de Bora. And there is friends have written about the wedding, which was very much a private affair, and there they were all drinking and having a good time. And he admits himself that he was a little bit of a bully, and he says, well, if Catarina doesn't work out, I always have the maid. Okay, so what happened here is that I think he knows he's going overboard a little bit, but having to use that tired phrase, having crossed the Rubicon, he couldn't very well come back, and so then he engages in excesses and more excesses. I don't think he was a bad man. I think he was a man impulsive, and perhaps he didn't foresee the consequences. Okay, let me move on with my notes here. His confrontation with the church, and then his break, and then his revolution or his reform, okay, it doesn't matter if you call it that, wouldn't have got very far actually, except that the German princes were very much, and here comes a political dimension which we cannot ignore. The German princes at that time were very much against the Emperor Charles V. Charles V was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, the Catholic kings. So he was also King of Spain, and the emperor of what was then called the Holy German Roman Empire. It was the Roman Empire now in the Germania region, okay, which is practically all that central of Europe, okay. Because I believe that they used Luther and Luther's break in order to promote also a political upheaval. But okay, so this is the theater of operations of Lutheranism. And if he had, as I said, if he had not been welcomed by the German princes, especially by Frederick III of Saxony, Luther's reform probably would not have gone any further than that. I think that when the Diet of Worms occurred, that sounds funny, come to think of it, doesn't it? The Diet of Worms. No. I just realized that. No, Worms is a city. Okay. I'm so sorry, I have to explain. I caught myself. Okay, and Diet was an assembly, a gathering, conference, as it were, which happened in January, from January to May in 1521. It was an assembly convened by the Emperor Charles V himself, the Holy Roman Emperor, really, as he was called then, to address these issues that Luther was talking about. So he calls Luther to explain himself, what he proposes, what this new thing and this new theology that he's preaching is all about, this new thing that is agitating the Holy Roman Empire. He wants an answer. That's Charles V. But Charles V is only 21 years old. He was born in 1500. And so he doesn't have the experience, he's not prepared, he doesn't know quite what is going on, he is a little bit confused. And so he did not act or react quickly to what was happening, which was really against him by the German princes. And so this inexperience of his allows Luther and the German princes, this new theology begins to germinate into which is going to end up being future revolts and revolutions, even by the German princes against the emperor, against the Habsburg dynasty, and for that Germanic empire to begin to crack open, because this is going to mean the beginning of the nation state, the beginning of nationalities, not one whole Roman Empire, as it were, now centered in Germany, but never mind, it was still called the Roman Empire. It's going to crack down, and so people are going to be independent nations from now on, which is what they wanted. They wanted a Germany, a nation state, into what then, in modern Europe, develop into, as I said, a nation state. And which one might argue that this division would lead to many wars all the way to the 20th century. We have to understand what happened then, that first rebellion, in order to understand the 20th century. So we have to do a political reading too of the consequences of Luther's thought and of German Protestantism. So it was not, what pushed him was not, may I repeat, the moral decadence that might have existed, and I don't doubt it, but it wasn't that. But it was motivated by a change in doctrine, a change that, but many Catholics also assumed that it was to do with the moral decadence of the Church, and that was not the case. He makes it very, very clear. Also because reform, as I said, had been taking place all over the place too. In Spain, there had been a reform well before that. There's a famous cardinal, you might have heard of him, Cardinal Ximénez. We call him Ximénez de Cisneros, we call him Cisneros, which actually went about this reform before Luther with a very, very strong hand. It wasn't even about indulgences. The problem was then also it was priests cohabiting with women against their vows of celibacy. That was a real problem too. And so Cisneros, this cardinal, went about investigating, just looking at everything and giving them the choice. You either have to stop right now or you have to leave the priesthood. And if they left the priesthood, they were given money to start a new life. They would be given some sort of, whatever it was. But they couldn't stay in. And it was a very, very strong reaction. So reforms had been going on, so it couldn't have been that. Okay. And there was so much chaos in the church. The moving the see of Rome to Avignon, all that. It was so many things going on. But Luther himself, he writes himself in his manifesto to the nobility of the German nation. He already begins to call it the German nation. In his manifesto to the nobility of the German nation in 1520, he writes, and I quote, I did not challenge the immoralities and the abuses, but the substance and doctrine of the papacy. This is my vocation. Even if the Pope were as holy as Saint Peter, we would still consider him impious, and we would rebel against him. We will fight him with the credo, with the creed, and the Paternoster, the Our Father, not with the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. In other words, we would not confront him with the Ten Commandments, because in this matter of morality, all of us are rather weak. End of quote. So can we have it clear that his reform, his rebellion was about doctrine? It wasn't about morality. Okay, so we said that he abandoned his religious vows as an Augustinian monk, and marries Caterina Devora. And because of the consequences of what is happening, thanks to this revolt, his Augustinian brothers in that monastery, in that convent, the German princes kick them out, close the convent, the monastery, and they give it to him, to Luther, as a mansion for him to live in. And that is where he lives, with his wife. Well, you know, for a conscience like that of Luther's, there had to be there a worm in his conscience saying, perhaps this is not quite right, you know. When he married, there were a lot of followers who actually left him because they really believed that he was trying to reform and going against these abuses of priests having lovers and so on. And then he goes, leaves and gets married, and they thought, well, this is not what we thought. We thought that you were just trying to reform them. So obviously this was something else. Yeah. Then Lutheranism began to expand to the north of Europe. Calvinism later will expand to Holland, tries to get into France and reaches Scotland, where English Puritanism will develop. But Lutheranism goes northwards, and it is very clear that in all these other northern countries they will inherit this, what is called the investitures issue. In other words, the struggle between the political and the religious, between the king and the pope, as it were. They all want to have the same outcome, the same success as the German princes had. And so in the whole of the northern part, the Germanic world, everyone is dealing with this issue of whether to obey the Pope or not to obey the Pope. The German, who to pay taxes to. Obviously, they didn't want to pay taxes. So once they break with Rome, as it were, then the empire, okay, there will be then a brutal fight between the nobles who gain that power and the rest of the peasants, who have now new masters and who are all Lutheran princes. And they find these new masters, the nobility, actually really predator-like against the peasants, which they couldn't identify with the church before. So, for example, with Lutheranism, which managed to get break the unity of the empire, as I said, a brutal fight against the peasants by their new masters. And so this is going to create a lot of revolutions, for example, the Anabaptists, which is another type of Protestantism, and fights amongst themselves, basically killing each other. But out of all this chaos, the real winners are the German princes. It will extend to Sweden too, for example, just as it is becoming independent from Denmark. And now, because of these German princes and the breakdown of the empire, something is going to change in Sweden too, because it was a kingdom conceived along the lines of an elective monarchy. The idea of a king out there, of a centralized state, did not exist. So we had what they call the elective monarchy. No central power yet to speak of. There is no sense of a central power in the state. But it will adopt now Lutheranism because the nobility finds also a good way of appropriating all the properties of the church. And from these, the nobility, the first king, successor king, King Gustav, becomes then a successor king. In other words, not an elective monarchy, but a hereditary monarchy. And this will be, for the most part, the future of the modern state. And so these centralized states, these powerful states, are now going to try to dominate themselves, dominate the church. The king will now be the one appointing bishops, evidently Lutheran bishops, not Catholic ones. And from there, they're going to decide which dogmas to believe or not believe, the prayers that are to be prayed, above all the properties of the church to be expropriated. And this will necessarily lead to a strengthening of the political power that did not exist before the centralized state until then. So the reading we have to make is that Protestantism in this Lutheran form, we have to see it also as a struggle between the temporal and let me rephrase that. The temporal meaning the political, in a special way. They used to say the profane, the profane or the temporal, or the political, we would say nowadays, that will triumph over the spiritual, the religious, the church. Okay, so now it is the political that takes over power. And in so doing, the political will become sublimated, as it were, that above the religious. And from there, for example, not only in England, though, we are all thinking of Henry VIII, but not only in England, in Lutheran countries too, you'll find from now on what they came to term the divine rights of kings, divine right of kings, which does not exist in Catholic theology. Yeah, but in the Protestant theology now, you're going to interpret it as, okay, so the Pope was the head of the church, the vicar of Christ on earth, that therefore he has some sort of a divine power. Okay, I cannot tell the people I have the power, the spiritual power now because I'm stronger politically. So I have to think of something, and so God anointed me as king. In other words, my right to be king comes directly from God. This was never defined in Catholic theology. In Catholic theology, it was sort of more circular. In other words, God acts on his people. Okay, the people in coming together in society, or in your tribe, or in your nation, or whatever it is. Okay, obviously will have a leader. Plato's philosopher king, or the king, whoever it might be, but the leader that will work on the interests of the people, kind of thing. That was the theology of it. In other words, God is involved, goes to the people, and then from the people to the king. Whereas in this new Protestant understanding, it's God anoints the king himself. So in the case of Henry VIII, obviously it's directly sort of his power is a divine power that comes from God, whereas before in the Catholic understanding it was God, the people, and through social structures ends up in the king. Yeah, but so now so therefore I'm king, so therefore my power is divine. Just like the power the Pope has. Yeah. So what we now see is the sacralization, if we can put it this way, the deification, as it were, of the profane, or the temporal, or the political power. The sacralization of political power that occurs and all the way to modernity, when through ideologies, we can even see it today, all the way to today, political power is transformed into an ideology, sometimes almost into a almost church. And in those days, to confront the Pope. If the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth, religiously speaking, we'll take this to the political sphere. We are chosen by God. Well, then the political leader is also chosen by God. And through the centuries, this will give rise to many of transmutation of changes. There is a famous anarchist, Marx Stinger, who picks up this theme, and he says that eventually what the French Revolution did was to pick up this idea, this old mantle of the divine right of kings, defended by Protestants, and then apply it, or replace it rather, to the divine right of the assemblies, or the divine right of parliaments. Yeah, so we are becoming now, at this time, secularized. Because we are putting, we can see the path, yes. First of all, the Pope, not the Pope. You have to fight the Pope. So the King. The King is the one ordained by God. Okay, and then from the King, it will pass to democracy and the assemblies. So the sacralization of power, which is what we're discussing here, becomes, to a large extent, almost you could say, a secularized theocracy. And this comes directly from all these new ideas of Protestantism. In order to fight the Pope, you have to make him the enemy, obviously. We are acquainted with this, okay, the bad guy, okay? So they represented him with a triple tiara. The prosti of Babylon, I think they use a harsher word, that we read about in the Apocalypse. And therefore, they also cultivated what theologians called an eschatological tension. What is that? The Pope is the bad guy that we have to fight in order to now defend our nation, yes? So the Pope is the Antichrist. Because in those days you had to put it in religious terminology, yeah? Okay, so that made sense. The Pope is the Antichrist. We are now in the last combat. Therefore, this demands a combat struggle to the very death against the Pope, who, being the Antichrist, they believe that the apocalyptic times were here. An apocalypse, in other words, the second coming of Christ, was already there practically, and it was unstoppable. If you already have the Antichrist, if the Antichrist has already manifested himself, that means that the second coming is near. Does this ring a bell? It has all happened before, you see. We're seeing it a little bit today. So this was unstoppable. So this caused in the Protestant world true revolutionary movements, precedents to the revolutionary movements that were to come later. And it is their logic that if Christ is coming, the second coming is here because the Pope is the Antichrist. So, as I said, if the Antichrist has been manifested, that means that Christ is coming. Christ is now coming very soon to establish his kingdom. How many times has this been used? And in what many different ways? By many different peoples. So Christ is coming now to establish his kingdom. And his kingdom will be a kingdom for the poor, for the meek. In this kingdom there will be justice for all. And because there will be justice for all, that means that there will be no more inequalities. There will not be people who rule over others. German princes, kings, beware. Yeah, there is a revolution taking place from below, from the peasants, led by groups, very powerful movements like the Anabaptists. And so there will be no one who will rule over others, so as to prepare us for that kingdom. What must be done is to end all hierarchies, be they ecclesial or be they of the nobility. We must end with inequalities, private property, and that is when we will see the appearance of the Anabaptists, which are, as I said initially, a truly revolutionary movement, about 300,000 people throughout the whole empire, taking up arms against the established powers now. An authentic revolutionary movement which, excuse me, many historians have said that until the French Revolution there had not ever been a mass movement such as that, equivalent to that. But can you see the connection to the 20th century about inequalities and private property and so on? This is interesting because interpreting these peasants' revolutionary movements who were convinced that Christ was coming, then it was all right to dynamite, as it were, the entire present world through bloody revolutions. There have been many Marxist historians who have said that this was the beginning, the genesis of Marxist ideology. Now, in the 19th century, you didn't need the Antichrist as such. The religious, the 16th century words were no longer necessary or applicable, but it was kind of the same thing. But what you have to see also at the same time is that these initial reactions, these political manifestations and all these confrontations, you can see that they are already preparing for what is to come, which is not necessarily the second coming of Christ, but it is a secular revolution. Because it's going to lead all the way to secularism. So in many cases, Luther himself, it's almost a mixture between and this is another topic, which is, I don't know whether it is sufficiently discussed. It is almost a mixture between the grotesque and the comical, because on the one hand, Luther was a fervent anti-Jewish man. Today we say Semite, yeah? Fervent. It wasn't only against the Jews. He had a thing about, he made a trip to Rome when he was still a monk, and he almost had to run from Italy, because just as when he was entering, and he hadn't spent there too long, he hated Italians. He explains how Italians, they are loud and they come and touch you and they kiss you. Mwah, mwah. It was a different culture, yeah. But it's not only a different culture, it was a type of person who had, I think he had some issues. It is true that Italians, kiss you and touch you and so on, but warm climate countries, people live outside. There's a different. I truly believe that climate actually influences cultures to a certain extent. But if you live in the north when it's cold and rainy, you don't live out there in the piazza. You live at home, yes, and you go out when you have to. There's a different cultures at the end, okay? But he squirmed, hated it. I think he had some issues. I don't know. Anyway. So he had this thing also against the Jews, very profound and very fervent, on the one hand. But he also, and at the same time, nevertheless, in his theology and his principles, adopts this sort of messianic thing, the core, the core of messianism, I don't know whether it is the core of... Yes, I suppose it is to a certain extent, because the Jews do not believe that the Messiah came. So it's very messianic. It's very Jewish, yes. And this will become even more profound with Calvinism, and we will see that in the next video. A historian called... Excuse me, oh gosh, I'm boring myself with this cough. A Jewish historian, her name is Lucy Varga. In a book, Truths... No, I'm confusing her. Hold on, let me find the right notes. Yes, sorry. He wrote in 1937, and she was Jewish. She spoke of a straight line. Other historians too, but she spoke of she wrote about a straight line from Luther or Lutheranism all the way to National Socialism. And he has a book about it, explaining. Well, this is quite amazing, okay, because it's like a charge, unfounded charge against it. But we see that it was this could be one of her arguments. It was the North Protestant, the northern part of Germany, the Protestant part, that voted overwhelmingly for the Führer, and it was the South that did not. There is a joke in Germany that in the Cold War, instead of dividing Germany between East and West, it should have been divided between North and South. The culture is very different, the Protestant North and the Catholic South. Okay. Now, then this book that I am reading on Protestantism goes on from having spoke about for quite a while at length about Luther and how the whole thing started, then moves on to the most important one, Calvin, and the Calvinist, and all its manifestations in very many different forms. And he finds that, for example, for Catholics, they will define themselves as Catholic, but they don't need a sort of an opposite enemy to know what Catholic is. In other words, I'm Catholic. I don't define myself as opposed to someone I'm fighting. But he claims that this is what Protestantism really is in all its different manifestations. It's more than about, but it's certainly positioning yourself against Catholicism. And he also points out, he will go on to explain about all other manifestations because of denominations, because he claims that Catholics do not understand Protestantism. They think it's Protestant, and they've certainly in Spain they never heard of, the Presbyterians or the, so it's Protestant, and so he's going to explain the many very manifestations of this. But there are some contradictions in Protestantism that it has to be difficult to be assumed. For example, in his change of doctrine, what Luther did was not only faith alone, yes, but it was scripture, sola scriptura, yeah. And he cheated a little bit because when it comes, the word sola that doesn't exist in the Greek, he added it. But in any case, he decided to do away with many things in the Bible. For example, the typical one is the epistles of St. James, because in that one it's all about works and conduct and so on. So he did away with that. This is okay. But he also changed a lot of other things. For example, of the 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, he decided that there were only 2. The 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, if I remember them, baptism, confirmation, marriage, matrimony, ordination of priests, confession, the anointing of the dead, and I missed one. Which one is that? I don't remember. There's another one. Okay, never mind. Okay. Anointing of the dead. Oh my goodness. The Eucharist. Okay, right. Okay, I was going to say the most important one. Perhaps it is. Okay, but Luther said no, there are only 2. There are only 2. Baptism and the Eucharist. He kept the Eucharist. Calvin is going to say that there are 3. And others will say that there are none. That is going to be a sort of a progression all the way to secularism. So there are difficulties. Yes, because is God a schizophrenic? I mean, how can it be 2 or 3? I mean, what? I mean, you have contradictory doctrines and all call themselves Christians. It's a contradiction here. There are contradictions there that I don't know that they have fully been assumed. And so it seems possible that, okay, so there are some difficulties, sometimes caused by unclear meanings, for which no resolution is possible, as it is in the case in ideologies. So, for example, in political terms, these contradictions between his personal anti-Judaism that he felt and all the way to German nationalism, which will lead to other things. Not only to just that, okay, because then there is also a romantic German nationalism, and there is also a Jacobin French nationalism, and Catholics do not understand that they are all very, very different. There will be a Swiss Calvinism, and then its version with the Huguenots. Then there will be Anglicanism, and then, of course, the two main divisions here are going to be perhaps what we could summarize as the Episcopalian and the Presbyterian sections or understandings of Protestantism. The Anglican Church, which the author says it is not such because there is no apostolic succession, okay? But even though not long ago, I think it's 1 or 2 years ago, they were able to celebrate one of their services or their rites. I think they call them services. Okay, in a basilica in Rome, I think the unmentionable, because I don't even want to say his name, allowed him to do so, but okay, so that is in the realm of Episcopalianism, which is what the Americans, Anglicanism will be called in America, yeah. But there is this other Presbyterian side to it, which is more from the Calvinist tradition, which is more like a sort of an association where, you come together and there is a consensus, an agreement over a series of beliefs, which, with the free examination of Luther, the sola fides, without tradition, the sola scriptura, they decide what is going to be and reach a consensus. So the community decides. Yes, there is this element in Anglicanism or Episcopalianism of the Anglican High Church. But okay, so this will require another video. Okay, I'm going to grosso modo talk about these different aspects of Protestantism and how it developed and eventually got to this American Protestant understanding, or the evangelicals and so on. Okay, so in the next video, and how eventually you're going to see where we are today and the geopolitical situation we find in today. If you pull the thread, okay, you can see where it all started and how it developed, but how it started. Different branches and so on. So I'm going to deal with that in the next video, because I think I have been going on for quite a while. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye.